Hi, I'm Nicholas Seminario, founder of Dark Angel Company. This podcast is to share the untold stories of just a few of the many people battling mental illnesses in this world. If you're in need of a little inspiration to keep fighting or to feel less alone in your battle, keep listening and share to spread awareness. This is the Dark Angel Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Dark Angel Podcast. I hope you guys have had a great last week. I just want to say thank you guys so much for everything lately. I'm going to give you guys a little discount code for the store. It's DAFAM, and that's going to give you 10% off for anything you guys would like in the store. That's just to show my appreciation for what you guys have done for me and all the listens and all the shares and everything like that. So thank you guys for that. Today is actually going to be a really interesting topic. I think we've all had our fair share of toxic relationships. And if you guys can't tell from that little clue, today we're going to be talking about relationships and how they're toxic, or, how to identify this toxic relationship in your life. I think, myself included, I have had a few toxic relationships, and it doesn't have to mean someone you're intimate with, right? This can mean friendships or, even whether it's family. Exactly. Family. Yes. And, I want to get into all of this and really kind of dive in and, just give our feelings on everything. There is this book written by Suzanne Dreggs. She's author of Toxic Friendships. And she says, toxic friendships happen when one person is being emotionally harmed or used by another, making the relationship more of a burden than support, right? So let's kind of dissect this and really jump into what this means, right? So if you have one of your friends, right, and all they're doing is kind of taking, and, it feels more of a stress and a pressure to be around these people than something good, most likely you're going to be in a toxic relationship, right? Whether it's a friendship, a family member, a relationship, these are kind of these signs of a toxic relationship, right? And like I said, I think everybody kind of experiences a toxic relationship one way or another. And, there's these common questions. It's like, why would you become friends with this person in the first place? Why can't you see these things? And it's not an easy answer.
I think a lot of times it happens without you really noticing at first. And I think by the time you do normally notice, you're way too deep into it to just make an easy decision.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and, kind of just to piggyback off that, it's so sometimes people who are the toxic ones in the relationship, it's a very manipulative kind of tactic that is used, right? It's not this simple thing where they're immediately, toxic. It normally forms over time, right? And it's to things that you kind of can't control. And once, like you said, you're kind of in it, it's almost too late, right? And then it's kind of hard to get yourself out of it. So it's like, it's such a tricky thing. And like I said, I've had my fair share of toxic relationships, and that's more specifically, I would say, with friendships. I would say that's really the only type of toxic relationship I've experienced is with friendships. And, I want to kind of get into that stuff, which we will, but what is your thought on toxic relationships, and has this affected you, or is this something that you haven't really experienced?
I mean, I've definitely experienced it. And I've experienced, I think, more than my fair share of it. And it's not something that you necessarily, one can see really happening in the beginning. And one thing I've noticed, too, is a lot of times in the beginning, it's almost too good to be true. A lot of times, And you can lead to having your values kind of placed at the bottom of the priorities by your friends or whoever it may be. It can be very hard to say no and hold your ground to the things that matter to you.
And do you think, not all cases, but do you think in most cases, the people who are toxic in the relationships, do you think they're even aware of it, or do you think this is something that they can't control?
Yeah, I've had situations where people have definitely, I feel like at least personally, they know what they're doing, and they're just okay with it because it's not affecting them negatively. And I've had situations where I don't think they really knew what they were doing. that was the only way they really knew how to act in that situation. So I think it's a little bit of both, and it's very independent to the situation.
Okay. And, would you say that sometimes, when we look at a toxic relationship, right, looking from the outside, do you think sometimes it's just those two people may not mix well, right? Do you think that it's always maybe somebody's just toxic, or do you think there's toxic situations where people just shouldn't be, meshing?
I think, sure, it can do with the people and their personalities, but I think it has a lot to do with, kind of what you saw growing up in how to interact with people. I've noticed a lot of times, like, I've had behaviors that necessarily weren't good, right? You could call them toxic, you call them whatever you want, but at the end of the day, they're behaviors that are disapproved of to some extent, right? And I just think that sometimes those behaviors are learned when you're younger, and you don't necessarily know what you're doing until you're older and you've had a chance to kind of look back on that stuff.
Okay. Yeah, and that I understand that, and it's like, for me, I feel, like you said, with that childhood, there's things that we learn, and obviously we all grow up in different homes. Even within the same home, you're growing up differently than your sibling.
It's a whole different experience.
Yeah, so there's, and look, like I've said before, our parents aren't perfect. Nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
So there's going to be traits that you're going to pick up that you think are normal, and they may not be. It may be something that's toxic.
Yeah, and there's one thing I'll say about those behaviors is one thing I've learned about those behaviors is growing up is, like, when you're a kid and even up through high school, you think everything is supposed to be like one set way, right? There's almost like one set way to do something. And I've realized everyone's kind of making it up as they go.
Yeah.
And as long as you're happy, and you're respectful and you have certain values that you adhere to, there's not necessarily one right way to do it, but there are wrong ways.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, and it's so funny you say that, where people are kind of just making things up as they go. It's so true. When you're little and you see people who have these businesses or these lifestyles that they're successful, and you're like, oh, like, it must have been so calculated, like they planned everything out. Like, no, most likely not. Look, there's exceptions to every rule, but most likely not.
There's just way too many things to account for along the way.
Yes. So why do you think people stay in toxic friendships or relationships? I have some reasonings as to why, but I'd like to hear what you think, what you think the reasoning behind it is.
I think most of the time you kind of just depend on that person to some extent. I think in order for a toxic relationship to happen, at least from what I have noticed and I've experienced, there needs to be some kind of almost like, I hate to use this word, but like hierarchy of like one person's just kind of a little bit more, I wouldn't say put together, but they kind of
alpha.
I don't know if that's necessarily the right word, but you get what I'm saying, right? One person is socially, whatever the word is, right?
The hierarchy. I think you're right.
A little bit above the other person in the sense of they are willing to be dependent on, and then they kind of use that against the person that is depending on them.
Yeah, I would kind of say something similar along those lines. It's where, like you said, you kind of feel like you're depending on someone, but also sometimes you don't see it, right? Sometimes it takes somebody outside to kind of call it out to your attention. There's relationships that have, you're kind of closed off from everything, and it's hard to see really what's going on. So it's like, it's very easy to get sucked up in it and find that to be your new normal, which it may be normal in your head, but it's realistically not normal.
Do you think the fear of change also kind of keeps people in that cycle?
Totally. 1,000%, right? People, we're human, right? A lot of us are scared of change, myself included. I hate change. So I know people who have been in relationships where they just don't want to change it, right? They're comfortable in their environment, and do I think they should be together? No, that's not really my business. I'm going to give them my advice and say, look, I don't think you guys should be good to, you guys are not good together. It's toxic. But people don't want to hear that, and they think it can change, and they think that it can be fixed. But most likely, sometimes it's so far gone. And if one person isn't willing to make a change, it's not going to change. So it's like you're kind of stuck in this position, and it's hard to overcome it, right? Like you said, people don't want to make that change, and I think that's a huge, huge impact on toxic relationships, right? Sometimes, like you always see stories of people who are abused in relationships and they don't leave, and everybody's like, oh, why don't they just leave? Like, it's not that simple. It's so down to like they make you feel like you're nothing, and
at the same time they make you feel like you're everything to
yes. And so when that's being done, it's like you don't know what's real, what's not. So you're going to believe that only person that's in your life, and it's like it's this vicious cycle.
I like what you said there, though, the only person. I think a lot of it, too, comes down to those relationships get isolated from the rest of your world in some sense. Like your friends or the person you're intimate with, it's a very private relationship, and you may go and do things in public, but the dynamics of all of that are very private and kept to yourselves.
Yeah. And look, I think, there's two sides of that as well. Like, there's plenty of people I know who like keeping their stuff off social media, and it's like that sense of privacy I think is great. I'm someone who does that as well.
Not necessarily privacy. I think privacy is important. I meant more like they isolate you essentially from your other relationships.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, exactly. And it's like you don't have that outside, interaction.
They become the person that's being toxic or manipulative or whatever. It becomes almost that North Star for you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Another thing is maybe someone is so amazing and sometimes they do big favors for you, but other times they do things that are really toxic, but then you're going to overlook it because of how great of friends or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever it is, to you they are. So it's like, this is another reason why people are staying in these environments. You're like, oh, this person, they called me names, but look what they did to me. They took me out to dinner, or they drove me here, whatever it is. It's like, you're going to sometimes try and justify it, just so it's like, oh no, they only do that sometimes, but it's okay because they're doing this for me, which yet again, it's kind of bringing us back to that topic of change, right? It's like you don't want to change your environment, so you're just going to keep on justifying to yourself why it's okay, what's happening. Another thing is you're scared to leave because you're scared of what life may look like without them. Maybe they're one of your closest friends. Maybe it's your girlfriend or boyfriend of a long time. Because that's normally hard, right? It's something that is toxic, but you don't want to admit it's toxic, and it's kind of hard to admit that.
What role do you think boundaries play? And do you think a toxic relationship could be managed? If they're willing to place boundaries on the relationship, do you think that it can save that relationship? Or do you think that there's really no saving toxic relationships?
So I kind of have two answers to this. First thing, I think boundaries are always great to have, no matter what, right? I think it's kind of like a mutual respect thing, if it's just like there should always be boundaries, right? No matter what. I feel like with anything, whether it's your parents, there should always be a certain level of respect. But now when those boundaries become intrusive and disrespectful, I think that's an issue, and I think sometimes that comes up in toxic relationships. What would you consider a boundary?
Like you said, it has to do with some element of respect towards someone's like personal feelings about something, right? So if they're not comfortable with something, they have something to do, right? Take it this way, and they're like, okay, well, this time I'm going to always need to do this for myself because this is what I do, right? That's your boundaries that you're setting. And they either respect that, right, which would be good, or they don't, which would be bad. So what would be like a negative version or a boundary where...
This is like an extreme example. If, let's say you're in a relationship, right, and your boundary is every first of the month, I have to go and kiss someone else. I have to.
Okay, so almost like... Okay, I get what you're
saying. Right, like that would be, I guess, like an extreme example or whatever it is, right? Like in a relationship. I guess that would be kind of like...
So, okay, just a boundary that may negatively affect the relationship.
Yes, exactly.
That the other person's just not comfortable with.
Yes, and I think that is where it becomes an issue. where there's definitely boundaries that are good, right? That it's like,
But
oh, this
it
makes
just
me...
goes too far.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
You know, because like there's probably certain things that if you're in a relationship, it's going to make you uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
if you voice that, you know, and the other person respects that, then that's a good boundary, right? Both people are understanding of it and respecting it. And I don't think that's toxic in any way, right? But then, like I said, you could get that other extreme where, you know, somebody's setting a boundary and one person's not comfortable with it, but you got to go with it. You know, it's like that's kind of where that toxicity comes into play.
Yeah, well, they're not really giving you an option.
Exactly.
Okay.
And look, I think that happens in friendships too, you know, whether it's, you know, whatever it is, or even in families, like people are just whatever it is. There's so many different ways things can be toxic. Another thing is maybe you simply don't know how to leave, right? How to start distracting yourself or how to end it all together, which we kind of touched on. And this is something where I want you to kind of get into, right? Because I know you've said you've had many different toxic situations. And how did you leave? Did you leave? Are you still kind of involved in these toxic relationships?
The ones that I have left hasn't been easy in the sense of the decision to leave was hard, or the decision to make the change was hard. I've learned through time that it, like, even though it may be hard in that moment, as long as I know that I'm placing my values and the things that are important to me, you know, and you don't make any decision, you know, quickly either. You know, you take your time, you think it through. You just have to essentially respect yourself more than anything else, you know, and realize that at the end of the day, you're your own person. You're not tied to anyone else, you know, and that can be really difficult to grasp, just knowing that you're not tied to anyone else after you've spent so much time or so many years with this person, you know, and it could be family, you know, and like sometimes I know this personally, I haven't experienced this, but say, you know, you have kids one day and your parents don't respect your boundaries, or your parents, say your in-laws, right? They don't respect your boundaries with your new family, right? And they don't respect the rules that your family has. In those moments, you just need to, not that you need to, but what has worked for me is knowing what is important to me, knowing essentially how I need to establish that boundary, right? Because you don't want to make people mad. You don't want to ruin a relationship, right? And sometimes people aren't doing it on purpose, you know? So if you can bring it to their attention kindly and just say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, you know, this isn't something I'm used to, or would you please respect this? You may not understand it, but please respect it because it's important to me. And it tends to work for me because a lot of people don't like confrontation. And when you put your foot down, a lot of times people get uncomfortable to some degree, you know, and that can give you the upper hand almost. And I don't want it to seem like a competition, but sometimes you have to be willing to step on a couple toes, and it won't be a comfortable conversation. It won't be a comfortable interaction, but knowing where you stand and knowing what's important to you and not letting anyone tell you differently in those moments is what I have found that has worked.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, kind of for me, I'm going to kind of get into a relationship that was toxic for me, and then I'm going to kind of talk about something where it's not toxic at all.
Before you get into that, what was the second part of your question, though?
It was just asking, how do you deal with it today, right? So if you're still in that toxic relationship, what are you doing to kind of get out of it, or are you looking to get out of it?
And sometimes, you know, values change over time too, right? And the things you care about and the things that are important. And sometimes in those relationships, they might not match up. You know, say you don't see someone for a little while, then you get back to, you know, hanging out with somebody or spending time with someone. Say, you know, you go in a long distance relationship or something like that, right? You come back together, you're going to have grown apart a little bit because you're your own person, right? And in those moments, you just have to be very aware of what that is. And if it's a friendship and, you know, maybe this point in your life, you're not necessarily going to be as close as you were, you know, or in a relationship, it might not be the same exact dynamic, right? And that's okay. You know, if you just don't want to spend as much time with somebody, you know, because their values have changed a little bit, you know, and I have experienced it a little bit today. And I don't think the answer is always to push someone out. If you can recognize it and they respect you and there's a mutual respect, I think you just either need to say, okay, we're our own different people right now. We're going to do our own different things, As long as that respect always stays, the friendship will last, or that relationship will last, And it just takes respect, it takes awareness, and I guess almost like a little bit of love for the person, like you don't want them to leave your life, but you just know you guys aren't in the same place you were a year or two ago.
Yeah, and I think definitely acknowledging it is important. But so I guess in your situations, it hasn't crossed that respect line.
Yeah, once respect is lost, it's very hard. It's very hard to save a relationship, just because I think I don't know if you can speak for this, but when I lose respect for somebody, I don't normally gain it back.
Me neither.
At least not very quickly.
Yeah, it takes a long time. Exactly.
Yeah,
it's not something that's immediate.
Yeah. So if you feel like someone isn't respecting you anymore and you've addressed it multiple times, then you make your decision.
Yeah.
But I think respect is the most important dynamic in any relationship.
I agree, and it's kind of a staple for all of my relationships also, whether it's with my girlfriend, with you, with whoever it is, like, I respect them, and that to me comes, love is first, right? You're going to love someone,
yes.
And respect is very close behind that.
Respect is not emotional, though.
Yeah,
respect
exactly.
is something that you need to, like, it's almost like you can kind of pull yourself back to.
Yeah, yeah. Exactly. I kind of want to get into two different examples of relationships. The first one I'm going to get into is more of that toxic example. This is somebody I've known for a long time. I believe I've known them since like 6th or 7th grade. Long time. And, when we first met, we had a great relationship, but it was pretty distant, and this is a friendship. Pretty distant, but every time we would see each other, it was always awesome, right? We would always get along. As we got older, went through high school, it was that same relationship. We always loved being together, but it was very few times we would be together throughout the year. Then eventually we got even closer and we started spending more time together. And, as I kind of went on, I just realized it was more of a toxic friendship than anything, right? It was like, it was very transactional. It was, I need this and then, you're going to get this. And it was very like toxic. And it wasn't, until like a year or two after, even more recently, where I kind of realized that, and I also give credit. Like, I don't like to put people down. So it's like, I didn't want to make a big stink about it. I kind of just left it as it was. I didn't antagonize it. I didn't, put more wood on the fire. I just left it. I kind of said whatever. And, because I do have a soft spot for people. So I do feel bad and that's the other thing. Nobody's perfect, so if people got stuff going on in their life, like, I always kind of put everything else aside, and no matter what, I'm still there, right? Like, I'm always, hey, how's everything going? Just want to check in, make sure everything's okay. No matter what, I want to keep that respect there. But it was definitely toxic, right? And it wasn't, for me, I don't like being in those environments. And it made me uncomfortable. It made me anxious, but I kind of, for whatever reason, like I guess you said, like that love aspect, it kind of makes you keep coming back to that person, right? It's like, no, I do like being with them. And when you're with them, it's great. And then it's like, kind of like we talked about before, you're kind of putting aside everything that they've done to you. And it's more of, oh no, but they did this, it's all the positive, which, it's a tough thing. And then, on the positive side of things, it kind of just, once we stopped, I guess, hanging out and talking as much as we wound up doing, my life did become a little less stressed, right? It was a little less toxic, I was like, that's not normal, right? You don't need to have a friendship based off of that. Like
anguish every day of that interaction.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, so then I also said I wanted to get into, a positive friendship or relationship. I have been dating my girlfriend for just over 5 years now. And I think we're the perfect example of a relationship who's not toxic. You know,
Yeah.
we're not a couple who argues. If we disagree on something, we talk it out and we kind of just agree on it or whatever it is right in that moment. You know, we don't let things sit there and we don't let it, just pile up and then you have all this stuff. And, I credit a lot of that to her. She's, like I say to everybody.
Good man.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky, but she's someone who, calms me down. I'm somebody who could easily be, in your face and loud, and she doesn't bring that out in me, and it's like...
You balance each other out.
Exactly, yeah. And that's something where when you're looking for a relationship, a friendship, whatever it is, you need to find someone who does balance you out and who isn't going to bring out this bad side in you, know, and I'm very fortunate that I don't get that brought out in me, and we've been dating, like I said, for 5 years. So since I was 15 and I just turned 15 and she was turning 15 in that summer. So we were together a long time. It's like...
Dude, 5 years is a long time.
That's a quarter of my life.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like, obviously we had to grow up too. It's like we were in high school and then now we're in college. So those are big building years on your life. And, I had to grow up most of all. I was more immature than she was. And, I kind of realized I was like, I can't be like this anymore, right? Like, I have to grow up as a person, evolve, and, that made us even better, right? Now we're growing together. And look, sometimes people grow apart, but luckily we're growing together. We both have goals, ambitions, and I believe we both better each other's goals and ambitions, So it's like, for her, she's doing a baking business. She's studying for her real estate exam. She's trying to do all of her own things. I'm doing my stuff. And we're supportive of each other and we're growing together.
So do you think that time spent apart from each other, taking it back to respect, right? Because clearly there's a lot of respect between you two, right? And the things that you individually have going on. Do you think that the time spent apart enhances that respect a little bit?
Yeah, so we didn't go to high school together. So she was at a different high school, so we didn't really see each other during the week. We got to see each other on weekends. And I think that was probably like the best thing ever. I would have rathered that, and then you appreciate even more when you're together. So yeah, I definitely think some distance is not bad at all. I think it's hard, and I would think it would be hard for me to do like a long distance thing, so that I think sometimes for me would be too much distance, but I think definitely like I always try and say, like, I look at it like this. It's that perfect balance, right? Like, you're not codependent on each other. Like, we aren't dependent on each other. Like, we do our own things, but when we're together, it's awesome. So it's like we kind of had to find ourselves, and luckily we were able to do that together. But if you're not with someone, find yourself, don't depend on somebody else.
Yeah.
And it really makes your relationship a lot healthier. And that's why I feel we have a healthy relationship. Like, we don't argue, we don't bicker, we don't, like I said, whatever, if we had a problem, we don't yell at each other, we don't raise our voices, we don't name call, we don't, nothing. It's a respectful conversation. Hey, I'm feeling this way, what can we do? And then it's either like, okay, yeah, let's do this, or let's do this. It's never any anger, like I look at it as like a teammate, right? Like, it's a partner. Like, you're not supposed to be against this person. And kind of back to what you were saying before with that like hierarchy and all that stuff, I think that's almost like a toxic trait, for people to be like, oh, who's the top dog in the relationship? It's like, that's kind of toxic.
Respect.
Yeah, exactly. Like, in my relationship, we're equals. I'm not better than her and she's not better than me. It's like, we're one and the same, right? So it's like, that's kind of how I look at it. It's like a teamwork thing, but it takes two people to do that, right? Like, it's very hard if only one person's putting the effort in. I got very lucky, right? We're both somebody who puts a lot of effort in and cares about each other and makes sure we talk all the time. And it's like, it can easily, go the other way for, anybody, right? It's like, but you have to put that work in. And at the end of the day, the most important thing too is yourself, right? Like you have to make sure yourself and you are.
And that goes in any relationship too.
Yeah. You got to love yourself and make sure you're, mature enough and not going to bring somebody else down.
Yeah, and I think it even goes further than that. Like you have to have your own life. No matter how many relationships or how intimate or anything, like you said, you guys each have your own goals and your own aspirations and all those things, and those are independent of each other. Those are things you guys are doing no matter whether you're together or not, And I think that's got to be, at least from my experience, the thing that has been the hardest to learn, right? Is as much as you love someone, as much as you want to spend all day with that person, friendship, family, whatever it may be, you need to have your own time. You need to have your own things that you can kind of bring yourself back to.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of where like my golf comes in, her baking comes in. It's like, we have things we love doing together, and then we also have things we love doing separately, and it's like, that's great. It's okay to, you don't have to do everything together. And I think that's super important, and that's just some things, that would constitute a healthy relationship, and look, like I said, and I'll say this all the time, nobody's perfect, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be times where you don't agree on things. There's going to be times, but it's how you actually deal with those times that really makes or breaks a relationship. You can easily try and take advantage and be that toxic person, and it is going to kind of, hurt the relationship. Or you can be like, no, why are we going to be angry with each other, And look, I've been dating her for 5 years, right? I think we've maybe had one argument in all 5 years of us dating. So it's like... That's crazy. Yeah, but it's crazy. But in the same breath, it's not like we're doing anything complicated.
Yeah.
It's just that respect, you know, and the love and respect of each other, and actually talking to each other like we're humans and we're not against each other, And I think that made us both grow as a relationship.
Obviously, there's going to be arguments, right? No one goes without having arguments, because that just means you're not really, essentially, you either one, don't have values, or two, you don't want to share them. And do you think that there's a point where, okay, obviously sometimes people overreact and they recognize that. And I'm sure a lot of these toxic relationships have some element of, oh, I didn't mean to, I'm so sorry, it won't happen again. When is too much?
I think it's when it really starts negatively affecting you and other people notice it, you notice it. I think that's when it's enough. You should never be in a relationship that doesn't make you feel good, right? Like, I've never once in my relationship been like, oh, this person makes me feel terrible. You know what I'm saying?
Spend more time with them.
Exactly. And it's like, you want to make sure the people you're around, like even with you, right? Like, I've never once had that feeling of like, oh, he makes me feel like I'm a terrible person. It's like, no, like, we'll joke with each other, obviously. Like, we'll have fun. We're friends, like, of course. Different. But, like, we know at the end of the day, we have each other's back.
Yeah.
And it's like that knowing that you're loved and you have that respect from someone. And when you start to kind of notice that that's not there, I think that's when it's enough.
Okay, so when you essentially goes back to respect, when you feel like they've lost respect.
Yeah, and look, I'm someone who's really big on respect. So for me, that would kind of be my signs. It's like, once and that's exactly what I did, right? Once I started realizing, like, I'm not getting respect, I'm kind of just looked down on. I don't...
Or looked at like almost like a free meal in a sense.
Yeah. Exactly. And like, I didn't like that.
Yeah.
So I wasn't going to let that, happen. So that would be, my answer. It's just that really respect, in my eyes. But there's definitely many other things, right? It's when other people around you are like, oh, you're going to let them talk to you like that? Like,
and honestly, I think it has to do a lot with each individual too. Like, respect, I know that's a very universal thing, that a lot of people want, but there may be other things that, No, off the top of my head, I'm not naming it. I can't think of anything. But there's other things that are important to other people, and it doesn't have to make sense to everybody. It only has to make sense to you, and the other person. If the other person doesn't get it, or they just don't care, that is enough. That's enough to say, okay, I'm done,
So what would you do? Let's say, and I don't know, you may have gone through this before. If you're in a relationship or a friendship, right, with somebody you love and you're super close, let's say you grew up with this kid, right? And now you're 18, 19, and you realize it's toxic, whether it's a girlfriend, whatever it is, somebody you're super close with. How do you get out? How do you get out of that relationship?
So the decision has already been made that it's done. Like that it's toxic.
It's
and there's
very
no changing
toxic.
It.
Yeah.
I think it's tough. I think there has to be a little bit of an element of it's tricky.
It is tricky.
Because normally the person who's being toxic, to some extent, doesn't necessarily care so much about whether or not the person stays. At least I've felt like that. Because it's almost easy if, if you're not going to text them, are they texting you? Right?
Yeah, no.
A lot of times in those toxic relationships, no.
Yeah.
So most of the time, if that's the case, it can be very easy to walk away, or in concept. Obviously, it's a hard emotional decision. I think it's very different. I need more details to give you a better answer, I guess.
Okay, so that would be for a friendship, right? Obviously, you're not living with the person. In most cases, sometimes you might be if you're in an apartment.
Yeah.
And that also, so in situations like that, what do you do when you're living with somebody that you realize is a toxic relationship?
You just need to hold your ground. You need to share what's important to you, and there's no compromising if you've compromised too much already. If you feel like you've given too much in that area and they're not willing to give back, then that's it. And look, relationships aren't meant to last forever. People aren't meant to stay in your life forever. And 10 years might be a really long time, and that might be the course of the relationship, and that's okay. Not everything is meant to last forever. And, sometimes people just aren't meant to be together, in a relationship too, in an intimate one, and that's okay. Relationships shouldn't be forced. There should be effort on both sides, and you shouldn't ever know that the person doesn't respect you. If you ever kind of get to that point, at least that's for me. If I feel like I know that they don't care about the shit I have to say. Sorry, I don't know.
No, you're good.
I can't curse,
you can.
But if they don't care, to me, it's over.
Yeah.
I might not leave right away. I may take my time. I may, sit on it. But kind of once that decision's been made, and I've noticed certain things, I'm out.
Yeah. And I also, I think it's very easy to talk about in theory. I think it's definitely easier than obviously when you're in that situation. But I've never lived outside of my house, right? So it's if I were with a friend or something where, let's say that friend that was toxic in my life, let's say we lived together, right? I even trying to think of how to get out of it, the first thing I would do is come to my family. I would tell them because I trust my family, and normally, whether it's my mom or dad or whatever it is, they normally have some advice for me. So that's kind of my first step I would take. And then obviously, if you're leasing, renting, whatever it is, it's not forever, that's a positive. So in that aspect, yes, you can kind of walk away from it. You can kind of say, look, even if you are living, look, I want, nothing to do with you almost. It's
yeah, okay. Say you're stuck though, right?
Yeah.
Withdraw. To me, what I would do in that situation is just withdraw myself from that relationship. You be respectful still. You never lose that respect for them, because then essentially you're on that same level.
Yeah.
Right? You're showing as little respect as they are, right? Which, okay, maybe it's justified, quote unquote, because of how they treated you. But at the end of the day, as long as you show respect and you can withdraw all you want, in that situation if you can't leave. And that, I mean, I guess that's really the only way, is you just kind of get buried in your own life and your own things. And through that, I've realized, though, too, when you withdraw sometimes you have to, for your own reasons. You got too much going on or whatever it may be. And maybe it's not a toxic relationship, but I've noticed when you do come back, there tends to be more respect for you. It's almost like what's that saying? Absence makes the heart grow fonder, or something like that. Maybe it's the heart growing fonder, or maybe it's the respect that you're showing them. You almost don't need them.
Yeah. I think that's really great. And especially for that situation, exactly. It's not where then you are depending on someone, right? Or you don't need that relationship. You realize it's not good for you. I like that. Withdraw. But now, what about in that situation where, say it's a marriage, right? Say it's now you're living with this person, and, then what?
You just have to be honest.
Yeah.
It's going to be an uncomfortable situation. If you try to get around it, it's just going to make it worse. You've got to be able to sit down and lay it out. And if you're not ready to do that, fine. Take all the time you need, you know what I mean? But when you do have that conversation, you have to be willing to say what is needed to be said for yourself,
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I was kind of, in my own head, I was like, I don't know what I would do. It's like, it's these questions that are not easy to answer, and it's like sometimes you need those, not simple answers, but those most obvious answers.
And sometimes, like you said, you get help from your family. Don't, pick one person, right? And get their opinion. Get their help, right? Say, I'm struggling to say this. How do I say this? Or how do I solve this problem, right? And then genuinely take what they say into consideration. Don't say, I don't want to do that. You know what I mean? Immediately tune out.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times that point of view is unbiased, right? Obviously they care about you if you're talking to them, but a lot of times if you are close enough to share that with somebody, you're close enough for them to tell you how it is.
Yeah. And look, there's people I know, there's people in my life where they are in a toxic relationship, and I've tried talking to them, and I'm like, look, you guys really are toxic. That's just kind of how, you have to lay it down. You guys are great people, but maybe you guys aren't meant to be together. And sometimes you don't want to hear that, which I understand, but you kind of have to take what people are saying. Not that you have to listen, you may feel differently, but from the outside, you're able to see, it's like you have no equity in that relationship or that friendship. So it's like, sometimes when people are on the outside and they're saying something, not that you have to go and act on it immediately, but you could ask yourself.
Listen to it. Genuinely hear it.
Exactly. You can ask yourself, hey, maybe they were right. Is it something I'm doing? Is it something they're doing? Is it something we can fix? Is it something we can't fix? And it's like asking yourself these questions because it might be hurting you, or that person you're with. And you guys might not be able to see it because you're so deep in it. You don't want to see it. Yeah.
And one thing I'll say, that helps, I guess, solve, it could be this or any of the things that we've really talked about on this podcast. It's spend time by yourself and genuinely, almost talk to yourself. When I have trouble thinking about or figuring something out, I'll talk it out to myself just to kind of hear it, and that may be weird and whatever, but
not at all.
It makes sense to me. And it's how I kind of almost get those emotions out, if that makes sense. Because sometimes you don't have someone to bounce it off of, or it's something very personal to you and you don't want to. And you just kind of need to hear it, because it's different than thinking it. You know what I mean? Because you're putting it into actual words and feelings that you can actually describe and all these things, you know? And through that time and that reflection, even if you're unsure of something, you'll move in a direction, and that's progress.
Yeah, and once, like you said, once you kind of speak it into existence, you're like, oh shit, this is real. It's like, I got to do something about it.
Yeah.
And, I know sometimes it's hard to hear those things, right? Sometimes you don't want to hear those things, right? Like, if somebody comes up to you and they're like, oh, your relationship's toxic. Like, your immediate
I've
thought.
been that person. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've been in that situation.
And your first reaction is, what? What are you saying? Like,
who were you to tell me?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's none of your business, like, whatever. And it's like, which I get, right? That immediate reaction is kind of to be defensive, but the person's looking out for you, and at the end of the day, they're not saying it for their own benefit, they're saying it to help you.
Yeah.
So, not that you, like I said, not that you have to act on the information, but take it in, analyze it, and understand, what somebody's saying.
Sleep on something.
Yeah.
Don't make decisions if you're not 100% sure. Like that, I used to make decisions on a whim based off of other people's opinions, and I was very unhappy with what happened as a result of that. I felt like I almost couldn't control it. And then I learned when I moved out, I guess, how to make my own decisions. And if you don't know, you just don't act. There's no timetable. You know what I mean? And you sure whatever deadlines and whatnot. But if you don't have to make a decision and you're not ready to, then you don't need to make one. It doesn't matter who's pressuring you. Doesn't matter who's saying what. Take your time, think it through. Because it's your life, And a lot of times, once you say something to someone or you share something, a lot of times it can't be taken back.
It can't, yeah.
And you just want to be sure about what you're saying.
Definitely. And that goes for relationships, that goes for friendships, it goes for family members. Respect everybody and don't just say things to say it, right? And I think that's kind of the moral of it, right? Respect those people who are giving you respect and don't take it for granted.
Yeah, and one thing I've learned also is just show respect to begin with.
Yeah.
It'll get you a lot farther, and the relationships you form will be a lot more genuine.
Definitely.
Because it's founded on respect.
Definitely.
Not created later.
Yeah. And just one last thing I want to touch on. When you're in a toxic relationship and you realize it or you don't, for those of you who do realize it, talk to someone, see what you can do, and see how you can get out of this relationship. Find that person who can help you get out of it. And for those of you who don't realize you're in it, and hopefully from listening to this, you could kind of say, oh, maybe I am in that toxic relationship. Find someone in your life who's going to kind of help you navigate this stuff. And that same thing, find somebody you trust to help get you out of this, because you don't want to be in a toxic relationship, right? It's not good for you. It's not good for your family. It's not good for your friends. It
drags down your life.
Exactly. It's hard to deal with. So kind of just take it and do something about it. Don't just let it sit there. And if somebody tells you, look, you're in a toxic relationship, don't get offended, kind of take it as like, okay, they're trying to help me, because you don't want to be stuck in these situations and have to live through this, because it's not healthy and it's not good for you. And then lastly, if you realize you're in a toxic relationship, but you do think it's salvageable, go to therapy with each other. Yeah. Figure out how to fix it and better it. There is always, ways you can fix things. It's not end all be all. So it's like kind of find a way you can better it and make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and look, a lot of people aren't going to be comfortable with the idea of going to therapy with someone else. You know what I mean? Like, even now, I kind of cringed at that almost a little bit, right?
Really?
Yeah, a little bit. Just because that feeling of almost kind of getting emotionally vulnerable with the other person about how they act, that can be a very uncomfortable situation, And if therapy isn't your way to do it, start off with just a conversation, And if therapy is the next step that you need to take it, I'm not a big fan of therapy, personally. You know what I mean? But it has its place.
Yes. And
everything has its place.
I've had this conversation with people also. It's like sometimes these people are professionals for a reason, right?
Yeah.
They know what they're doing. And realistically, yes, a conversation's great. But if you have that toxicity in your relationship, even if you have that conversation, that toxicity is most likely still going to be there, right?
Yeah.
Unless you have somebody mediating it. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That therapy.
To call out the BS on both sides.
Yes, exactly. Because, having a conversation and calling it out is amazing, right? It's that acknowledgement. That's great, right? You're recognizing that there is an issue there, but that doesn't mean it's going to be solved just from recognizing that issue.
And it takes a lot of calmness and respect to have those conversations, to begin with, and then to even go to therapy,
Yeah. It's something that will help, if you find the right person. Thank you guys so much for listening, and don't forget to check out Dark Angel Company on Instagram at Dark Angel Co. and online at darkangelco.com. If you're interested in supporting and spreading awareness towards bringing light to a dark topic together, then tune in next time.